Now we move on to a very, very important topic, and this is the topic of hotspots. This is one area when we talk about biodiversity hotspots. This has been a hotspot of questions also for UPSC. There has been a lot of questions that have been asked, from the definition of hotspots, from the meaning of hotspots, from the areas where hotspots are located, especially in case of India. All these kind of things become very, very important. Any current affairs that you also come across with respect to hotspots, especially before your prelims examination, that will also become very important for you. And just remember that this is one of the key areas that UPSC always try to look after and ask questions from. So when we talk about biodiversity hotspots, what is the meaning and how did the term come into picture? When we talk about hotspots, this is something that is not a very old term. This is something that actually started to come very early in 1990s itself, where an ecologist named Norman Myers was the one who started to make this term popular. There were two papers that he had published, one in 1990, which was called as the Environmentalist, and then after that there was another publication in a very famous journal, that is Nature, where he had used this term hotspots. Now when we say hotspots and when he started to define hotspot, what was the meaning of it? Now if you look at the biodiversity, and if you have seen the kinds of ecosystems that we have on the earth, you will notice that most of the organisms, or rather majority of the organisms, lie in very small amount of areas, and these areas can be very easily marked and said that okay, these are the areas where we find most of the species, whether plants or animals. This is one thing. Apart from that, we also see that many of these areas where the biodiversity is very, very high, what we observe is that threat to biodiversity is also really high in these kind of areas. The threats could be natural, the threats could be human, but most of it obviously are human induced. So when we look at biodiversity hotspot, what do we mean? There are two major conditions that are put if you want to define an area to be a biodiversity hotspot. What are these conditions? One, it contains at least 1500 species of vascular plants found nowhere else on the earth, meaning that we are talking about endemic species. And at the same time, they must have lost at least 70% of its primary native vegetation. So if it's an area that has very high biodiversity and at the same time it's an area that has lost majority of its biodiversity, in that case we will be able to classify that area as a hotspot of biodiversity. So when you look at the world map, you'll see that there are a total of 36 areas in the world that have been marked as biodiversity hotspots. Initially, when the term was coined and when we were looking at all the areas, there were 25 hotspots that were marked at that point of time. But later, with more research coming in for different kinds of areas in the world, we saw that this number increased to 36. And the very recent ones, especially, 25 to 34 had happened very quickly, but two more additions had happened. If you look at the map, you have this part of Australia. This was the 35th addition. And then after that, you have this part of the USA, that is the eastern plains of the United States of America, which were added as the 36th region. And when we talk about Australia, we are talking about the eastern forests that were added as the 35th hotspot of biodiversity. So these two have been the latest additions to the list of hotspots of biodiversity. So when we talk about hotspots of biodiversity, again remember there are two conditions. One, at least 1500 endemic species, and second, at least 70% of the primary native vegetation being lost. Now, what is the importance of hotspots of biodiversity and why did this term become so important and so widely discussed? So now when we look at hotspots, if you look at just the raw data, what you will see is that approximately just 2.4% of Earth's land surface comes under biodiversity. In totality, if we look at the earth, land and water, in that case it comes out to be approximately 15 to 16% of the total earth. But just this 15 to 16%, even in this, most of it is water, and water does not have as high biodiversity as compared to land, right? So when we talk about the land surface, and even if you combine the water surface, you'll see that it supports more than 60% of the entire list of species that are present on the earth. More than 60% is being governed by only such a small area. So that's why we need to take care of these areas. That's why these kind of hotspots need to be demarcated, and we need to take care of them. Because if we start to lose the biodiversity in these areas, and as we just discussed that these are areas which have lost more than 70% of its original vegetation. In many of the cases, it has been seen to be more than 85%, that more than 85% of the primary vegetation has already been lost. So in these cases, looking after these hotspots of biodiversity becomes very, very important, because they are sustaining more than 60% of the total organisms or the total species that survive on the earth. Not only this, many of these regions are the regions where you will see that even human population is highly dependent on what they get from these forests or what they get from these areas. If they are destroyed, the livelihood, the survival of a lot of native human species which live in these areas are also threatened. So you have to look at all these kind of importances of hotspots of biodiversity and the reason why we had to mark these areas and take care of these areas. So again, going back to the map, when you look at India, what do you see? You see that the Himalayan region comes under hotspots of biodiversity, the Western Ghats area comes under the hotspots of biodiversity, and the northeastern region of India comes under hotspots of biodiversity. Not only this, even Andaman and Nicobar Islands also come under hotspots of biodiversity when it comes to India. So in case of India also, these have been regions where we have seen that a lot of care has to be taken. A lot of endemic species are present in these areas, and the extinction rate in these endemic species are very, very high. And the loss of endemic species is disastrous not only for those species but also for human survival. So that's why all these areas needs to be taken care of. So when we talk about the importance of hotspots, first of all, it maintains the biodiversity, huge number of species present here. And what we have observed is that the map of hotspots, they overlap extraordinarily well with the map of natural places that most benefit people. So that's why I was talking about the natives that live in these areas, the people who live in these areas who are highly dependent on what they get from these hotspots of biodiversity. So that's why it becomes another reason why we must take care of the biodiversity. So this is something that actually can come as a mains based question also, that is focusing on hotspots a key to preserving biodiversity. Let's say this is a question that has been asked to you for maybe 10 marks, 12.5 marks or 15 marks depending on what is the pattern being followed by UPSC. It can come in 150 words also, but highly likely that it can come for 250 words. So what should you write? What are the points that you have to make if, let's say, a question like this, a similar question, let's say like this, comes in the examination? Now see, when such a question comes in the examination, focusing on the positives becomes important, but at the same time looking at some of the shortcomings of a concept like this also becomes important. So what we are going to do in the next 5 to 10 minutes is try to analyze how this is a very helpful concept when it comes to biodiversity hotspots, but at the same time, what are the shortcomings that a concept like this has, and what are the areas of future to look upon, and how do we start to think beyond hotspots. So these are few of the things that you should understand. So first of all, when we talk about focusing on hotspots, why is it important and how is it important? Now just think of these areas. What did we say? Just approximately 2.4% of the area of the earth having or supporting more than 60% of the species on the earth. So we are looking at a strategy that helps us conserve more than 60% just by focusing on 2.4% of the land area. And this is very significant because when you look at the conservation efforts, then conservation efforts, especially at the time when we are looking at such a huge issue with respect to wildlife conservation, and the extinction rates that we have observed, looking at all these problems, you know that conserving this becomes very, very important. That is one. Apart from that, look at all these areas. These areas have a huge potential. These areas have a lot of support system that is provided to the earth. For example, most of these areas are huge carbon sinks. Because of the forests that they have, they are huge carbon sinks for the earth. And especially given the levels of pollution that we are looking at today, the amount of carbon dioxide that is being let out into the atmosphere, it's very, very important to have areas like this which can act as sinks to carbon dioxide. That's one. So first thing that we can say is that it's an approach which basically is looking at a kind of save the maximum strategy, right? We are trying to save the maximum with the resources that we have. Not only this, when you have a concept like this, you'll see that mobilizing of funds also becomes very, very easy, because you have all these areas, you know that these are the areas to focus upon. So all the kinds of economic steps that needs to be taken for the conservation efforts, they can also be taken very easily. So very importantly, mobilizing the funds becomes easier. And we have seen examples of this. Once Conservation International, the main organization behind looking after all the hotspots, once it had taken the concept after Norman Myers, what we observe is, and this is a data going back 2014, we have seen that more than $1 billion have been given to the conservation efforts just focusing on the hotspots. So once this concept has been derived, once it has been established, then after that we see that taking economic steps also becomes very, very easy for us. So that's another very important part. Then after that, one point that we already discussed is about the livelihood of people living in these areas. So when we look at this, some of the estimates that we have come across, for example, one of the earlier studies that was done was that approximately 1.1 billion people are completely dependent on hotspots. I mean, they have been living in these kind of areas where hotspots of biodiversity are present. 1.1 billion, and over last 20 years it is said to have increased by approximately 36%. That is, today we are looking at approximately 1.5 billion people who live in the areas which are in the biodiversity hotspots. So if the conservation efforts are not made for these kind of areas, we will have to face a huge problem with respect to these people who are completely dependent on these areas for their livelihood, all the things that they get from the forest or they get from the wildlife, right? So this is very, very important part. Now, one more thing, apart from the direct benefits that we are looking at, you should understand this. This is a concept which is very simple. We have just two criteria that we have defined. One, that there should be more than 1500 endemic species, and two, that more than 70% of the primary vegetation should have been lost. So it's a concept which is very, very easy for people to understand, for the decision makers to understand, for the political setup to understand, and for the people who would provide you with the funds to understand. So because it's a simple concept, it's easy to understand, it's easy to get funds to understand. So because it's a simple concept, it's easy to understand, it's easy to get the aid and to get the help that is required in conserving all these areas. Looking from that point of view also, you have to understand that focusing on hotspots becomes a very, very important concept and helps us in conserving a lot of biodiversity. That's there. But at the same time, this is also a concept that has come under a lot of criticism. There have been criticisms with respect to hotspots, and many of these points that have been raised are actually valid. So what are we talking about? We are talking about the fact that we just discussed this, that it's approximately 2.4% of the land area, meaning that majority of our conservation efforts are only on 2.5%. So we are looking at approximately 97.6% of the area which is not our priority. We are not looking at all these areas to conserve. We have certain efforts, but the amount of efforts that have been put in just to the 2.4% is no match for what could have been done for the rest of 97.6%. So that's why this is one criticism that it often comes across, that what do we do about all these areas which might be important but do not lie in that 2.4%. And this is where there is one concept that comes into picture, which is called as cold spots. Biodiversity cold spots. So what is the meaning of biodiversity cold spots? We are looking at all these areas apart from the hotspots of biodiversity, where you have species, where you have very important species, maybe you have endemic species which are very important for the survival of that ecosystem, but they do not fall under the bracket of hotspots of biodiversity. And since they do not fall under the bracket of hotspots of biodiversity, there are minimal conservation efforts that are taken for these areas. Let me take some examples. One example for cold spot could, let's say, if we talk about India, we know that we have certain hotspots here. We have the Western Ghats, we have the Himalayan region, we have the northeastern India. So we know that these are the areas which have come under the purview of hotspots of biodiversity. But we have the entire plains, we have the Thar desert, we have the plateau region, we have all these areas which do not fall under hotspots of biodiversity. Now take one example. December 2019, there was one new species of frog that was discovered in Koderma district in Jharkhand. This is an area that lies in the Chota Nagpur plateau, and that's why it's not a hotspot. But you have found a new species of frog. And amphibians, and we'll have a discussion on amphibians and the disappearance of amphibians and how it impacts the biodiversity and everything. But finding an amphibian in a cold spot where there is no conservation effort, where there is no mobilization of funds, nothing is being done, is something that we need to look upon. So our conservation efforts have to come to these kind of areas also. We have to take a notice of what is happening to areas like this, where we are able to find new species of frogs. You just go by the Hindu newspaper, and every new discovery of a new species that happens, you will observe that most of the frog species that are being found or that are being discovered, they are being discovered either in the Western Ghats or in the Northeast. So the rest of the India is not looking at a new species of frog. So the rest of India is not looking at a new species of frog at all. So that's why the conservation efforts always will be focused on these kind of areas. But when you find a new species of frog in Koderma, this is something which is very different. And that's why the concept of cold spots take a center stage in such a case. Now then, there's another example. And this is not an example of a cold spot, but let's say if we talk about the Central African region. Central African region also has a very good ecosystem, very well functioning ecosystem, a huge sink for carbon dioxide. It has great biodiversity, but at the same time it does not fall under the bracket of hotspot. Why? Because we have not lost more than 70% of the area. Number of endemic species are although very high, but we still are not able to classify this as a hotspot. So when we talk about the conservation efforts, do we wait until it also loses more than 70% of its area? Would that be wise? No. The answer is no. Because we need to take all the steps necessary to conserve these kind of areas which are very rich in biodiversity, but is not classified as a hotspot of biodiversity. So our conservation efforts are not that great. And if you look at the data of the last decade, you'll see that a lot of deforestation has happened in these areas. A lot of extinctions have happened in these areas because it was not a hotspot. So this is another point that needs to be taken into account. Then another criticism is that it is partly economic, right? Because we are looking at the funds that can be given for conservation efforts. We take the conservation efforts to these areas and focus on conserving just these small packets that we have on land on the earth. So that is also one of the criticisms that it has come across, that it is something which is mainly an economic approach, and the conservation of full range of biodiversity cannot be done unless the focus also shifts on other areas. Then, as we just discussed, some areas, despite being poorer for the number of species, play an important ecological role, and that's why these kind of areas are being defined as cold spots. Now then there is another criticism that this is a strategy which is being sold as a silver bullet strategy for everything. That is, we are looking at it as a cure it all strategy, that it is something that will cure everything, every problem with respect to the loss of biodiversity or conservation efforts that are required to look at these kind of issues. So it is not a silver bullet. As we discussed, that we are talking about just 2.4% of the land area of the earth. So when we are looking at just 2.4%, it cannot be seen as the strategy, as the only strategy, as the silver bullet. So that is another criticism that it has come across. And then one more problem is that it completely ignores the regions of ecological transition. We just look at the core areas, all the conservation efforts, whether we are looking at the protected areas, etc. Everything happens within that hotspot. Not only that, what we have also observed is, for example, many of the protected areas that are there worldwide, all these protected areas are also pocketed. You will see that even within the hotspot, not the entire hotspot has been clubbed as a protected area, only certain parts. So basically you can say that there are hotspots of hotspots where more conservation efforts have been put in. Protected areas, wildlife sanctuary, national park, etc. have been created in these kind of areas. So still it is not taking care of all the species or all the areas that lie inside that hotspot. So that is another issue that we face. Then after that, there is another criticism, and that is about the marine ecosystem. So we discussed this, that most of the hotspots that have been defined, they have been defined for the terrestrial ecosystems. We have not defined anything for the marine ecosystems. Now, when we talk about marine ecosystems, we can take coral reefs as an example. We know that they have a huge role to play when it comes to conservation efforts. But since they do not fall under the bracket of hotspots in most of the cases, we do not see a clear strategy with respect to how to conserve the corals all across the world. So that is one more issue. And if you talk about deep waters, so more than 60% of the entire earth is deep water. But there's nothing that has been done for deep water. There's no strategy, no chalked out strategy, no popularized strategy that we have for the deep waters or the oceans. So that is another issue that is there. So there are all these criticisms that the hotspots come across, but at the same time you have to understand that when we talk about efforts, the first thing that it does is that we are looking at saving more than 60% of the entire earth. We are looking at saving more than 60% of all the species. That's very, very important. Secondly, it is an effort. It has been an easy effort to follow, and that's why people have been following it. That's why we have seen funds being raised for it. World Bank has been providing fund, for example, and that's a huge thing. Policymakers across the world have been able to follow the strategy, conservation strategy with respect to hotspots. So hotspots, although cannot be seen as cure-all strategy or let's say a blanket strategy for each and every kind of conservation efforts, but at the same time you have to understand that it's a very, very important strategy. It takes care of a lot of things. Yes, some additions are required, but you cannot say that this is an effort which is a wasted effort. It is an effort that cannot help in conserving the biodiversity. So if you are looking at, let's say, writing an answer, for example, then in that case you have to understand that largely your answer has to be very positive. You start with positive points, you jot down all the important positive points that we discussed. Very briefly, some of the criticisms that it has come across, you can mention them, but you have to end on a positive note, because at the end of the day, this is not a concept which is a wasted concept. It is not a concept that can be thrashed. Only certain additions, modifications are required. Certain additions of the areas like cold spots that we discussed can be suggested, but at the end, it is something which is very, very positive as a conservation effort. So this is about the hotspots of biodiversity. Now, a concept related to hotspots, or rather richness of biodiversity, is a concept of mega diverse countries. And there are two things that you need to understand parallelly. One is mega diverse countries, and the second one is like-minded mega diverse countries. So what are these two concepts? Let's try to understand. So first, when we talk about mega diverse countries, this is a concept that was founded back in 1998 for the first time, when an agency named as World Conservation Monitoring Center, which works under UNEP, it had founded the concept of mega diverse countries for the first time, because it came to a conclusion that if you look at the entire biodiversity of the earth, there are certain countries where the onus of this biodiversity lies, and these are the countries which will have to take care of the biodiversity of the world, because there were 17 countries which were listed in this list, and these are the 17 countries which have more than two-thirds of all the vertebrates, that is non-fish vertebrates, and more than actually 75% of all the higher plant species. So more than two-thirds of vertebrates and more than 75% of all the plants. This was a huge number. And all this biodiversity is just restricted to 17 countries in the world. So that's why these are the countries which will also have the political responsibility to conserve biodiversity. So that's why this concept came into the picture, and there are 17 countries which came in the list. So you have Australia, Brazil, China, Colombia, Congo, Ecuador, India, Indonesia, Madagascar, Malaysia, Mexico, Papua New Guinea, Peru, Philippines, South Africa, United States of America, and Venezuela. These are the 17 countries which were identified at that point of time, that these are the mega diverse countries of the world. Now, there are certain premises on which the concept of mega diverse countries was propounded. So if you look at these 4 points, the first was that biodiversity of each and every nation is critically important to that nation's survival and must be fundamental component of any national or regional developmental strategy. This was the first premise. Second was biodiversity is by no means evenly distributed. Of course, we know this. And some countries, especially in the tropics, harbor for greater concentration of biodiversity than others. And this is something that we have been discussing, that near the equators you have higher biodiversity, away from the equators you have lower biodiversity. Then some of the most species rich and biodiverse nations also have ecosystems that are under most severe threat. Now, severe threat from many reasons. One, climate change. Second, overpopulation. You will see that many of these regions of the world where all these hotspots lie or biodiversity lies, these are also the countries which are highly populated. So that's why you can also say that the pressure that the flora and fauna of these countries have is also greater as compared to many of the other countries. Then, to achieve maximum impact with limited resources, conservation efforts must concentrate heavily on those countries richest in diversity and endemism and most severely threatened. Resources invested in them for conservation should be roughly proportional to their overall contribution to the global biodiversity. So, amount of resources that should be invested into these countries should also be proportional to the amount of biodiversity share that these countries have in the world. So these were the 4 premises on which the concept was propounded, and based on these you have all these countries. Now if you look at the criteria on the basis of which this concept came into the picture, one, that all these countries have at least 5,000 of world's plants as endemics. 5,000 plants endemics. Please remember this. And then have marine ecosystem within its borders. And this was the second criteria that was put into picture for any country to be classified as a mega diverse country. Apart from that, there were certain other secondary conditions also that were put in. For example, animal and invertebrate endemism, species diversity, higher level diversity, ecosystem diversity, and presence of tropical rainforest ecosystem. So these were some of the secondary criteria that were also taken into account. Now, this happened, and this was 1998. But what we saw after that was that in 2002 there was another concept that came into picture, and this was like-minded mega diverse countries. So what happened was that in 2002 many of the countries and the environmental ministries and agencies of these countries had come together in Mexico, and they founded the like-minded mega diverse countries, understanding that these are the countries which have the onus of responsibility. They have to take the steps for conservation of biodiversity, and that's why they thought that they should be the ones who should control how the thing should happen, and they should take all the appropriate steps that are required for the conservation of biodiversity. Now, some of the key areas that like-minded megadiverse countries wanted to protect are very, very important to understand. One, for example, the focus that they had was on the traditional knowledge that many of these countries have with respect to the biodiversity. So this traditional knowledge should be protected. This was one. Then after that, one more thing was sharing of the genetic information and resources, and at the same time sharing of the benefits which are coming out of the resources that these countries have. So these were three major things that were taken into account, and we saw that like-minded megadiverse countries was founded. So if you look at the list of like-minded megadiverse countries, you have the following. You have Bolivia, Brazil, China, Colombia, Costa Rica, Congo, Ecuador, Ethiopia, Guatemala, India, Indonesia, Iran, Kenya, Madagascar, Malaysia, Mexico, Peru, Philippines, South Africa, and Venezuela. Now, if you compare the two lists, you will see that there are certain countries that have been excluded. If you go back to the list of megadiverse countries, for example, you will find that Australia was there in the list. Apart from that, you also have Papua New Guinea that was there in the list. And thirdly, you have the United States of America, which is there in the list. So these are the three which were excluded from the list, and this is the list of the countries that you have. Now here also there are new additions that have happened, because when you talk about this list, it has a total of 20 countries. So the original list had 17, 3 of which have been excluded. That means 6 have been added. So which are the countries which have been added? This list also probably should be known. So for example, you have Bolivia, which was not there in the list. You have Kenya, not in the list. You have Iran, which was not in the list. You have Costa Rica, which was not there in the list. Ethiopia, not in the list. And Guatemala, which is not in the previous list. So these were the 6 countries that were added. For example, Iran was the newest addition. Initially, the list actually had 18 countries, but later we saw that 2 countries were added, that were Iran and Kenya. These were the countries which were added later.